Hi, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here among such distinguished company, and I'm here to talk about one of our major archival initiatives at Texas. It's changing the way we collect in and about Latin America, and that is our post-custodial archival program. Is Ginny Steele is still here. Some of this will sound familiar to her. You heard her use that term, and I think one of the things that my talk will do will put a little bit of a theoretical framework around some of the things that she has talked about and provide more detail about what we're doing at Texas. But first, I wanted to just take a moment to recognize how important this particular forum is, calling attention to the need for reconceptualizing this global supply of and access to information resources. I appreciated Bernie's reminder yesterday about the Cold War context in which CRL came to be, and its early emphasis on securing international materials on behalf of academic libraries in the United States. And as someone who has spent her professional career at the intersection of Latin American studies and academic libraries, I can tell you that CRL is more important than ever when it comes to addressing the larger issues surrounding access to international scholarly resources, and clearly major funders agree, including the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation. I've been involved with CRL's Latin American initiatives for several years now. Once they draw you in, you can never leave. The Latin American Materials Project, with its emphasis on preservation of at-risk collections, and then also LARP, the Latin American Research Resources Project, a broader initiative that focuses on open access to Latin American resources and cooperative collection development, among other things. And I know many of your institutions participate in these programs as well for Latin America and for other regions of the world, including CAMP, the Cooperative Africana Materials Project that provided the funding for some of Derek Peterson's work in Uganda that we heard about yesterday. These initiatives survive thanks to the dues that each institution pays, and I hope that this forum is one reminder that those dues are a good investment. From where I sit as the director of a major Latin American collection, the value of this structure under CRL's Global Resources Network is the creation of spaces to articulate, think about, and craft potential solutions for the larger global issues that no single institution could tackle on its own. And I think that's been made very clear here today and yesterday with the various talks that we've heard. We're all grappling with some very big issues, and CRL has done a good job of helping us frame them as the big issues that they are and creating spaces for us to talk about them as a group. That CRL has been so plugged into area and global studies, librarian communities, and their professional organizations is a testament to its belief in the value of area expertise, even in the context of trends toward internationalization and globalization of higher education. So in short, we are a good team. So if your librarians come to you with a request to join any of the CRL regional groups, I hope this forum gives you the confidence to say yes, knowing that the relatively small fee is money well spent, and I assure you Bernie did not pay me to say this. And now, back to our regularly scheduled program. My talk today is a bit broader than the description that you see in the program. I'll focus a bit on our work in Guatemala, but in the context of our larger post-custodial initiatives. And I'm even deviating somewhat from my original planned remarks to draw on some of the issues that came up during yesterday's presentations and questions. And you know you're at a good conference when you have to leave the reception early to go rework your remarks to reflect what was said that day. So if it seems that there's a disconnect between some of my slides and what I'm actually saying, that's why. We've heard the term post-custodial a few times today and maybe even yesterday. It's not something we made up at Texas. It's a term that's been around in the archival community since the early 1980s, although its current usage and meaning is more recent. Here's what the Society of American Archivists has to say on the matter. It's the idea that archivists will no longer physically acquire and maintain records, but that they will provide management oversight for records that will remain in the custody of the record creators. To understand what this really means, it's useful to reflect on how we traditionally build archives as a profession. In general, when we acquire new collections, either by purchase or donation, the collection owner transfers both physical and legal custody of the collection to the institution as part of that transaction. And once that transfer takes place, a very common routine occurs. We process it, arrange it, and describe it so that we can facilitate access by our researchers. And then we secure the collection in our stacks or in storage, and we provide access in our reading rooms and on site. This is very much in line with standard archival practice in the United States, established and codified by our national archives. And the world-class collection of the Benson were built this way, and in many cases we still follow this model. In contrast, post-custodial archiving allows for the preservation of cultural patrimony by creating the conditions with which an archive remains in its place of origin. For LLILAS Benson, that's Latin America. And I just realized I used the term LLILAS Benson, so I should clarify. In 2011, the Benson Collection and the Institute of Latin American Studies at UT Austin formed a partnership, and we're jointly known as LLILAS Benson, and our post-custodial initiatives are part and parcel of that partnership. So you'll hear me refer to LLILAS Benson throughout this talk. The roots of our post-custodial program lie in the Human Rights Documentation Initiative that Jeff mentioned at UT Austin. It was a cooperative project of the UT libraries, including the Benson and the Rappaport Center for Human Rights at the UT Law School, and it had 6 partners, 2 in Latin America, 2 in the United States, 1 in Southeast Asia, and 1 in Africa. And the Genocide Archive of Rwanda was actually the first partner of that project. So T.K. Sangwan was our first human rights archivist, and she's now at UCLA working on that ephemera project that Ginny mentioned earlier. So the connections are also on the personal level. And I see Marilyn Myers from the University of Houston. Her now head of special collections, Christian Kelleher, was the head archivist at the Benson, who was also instrumental in getting this off the ground, particularly because he happened to have a background in Rwanda, I believe, with the Peace Corps. So the connections are spread out. As the original project was envisioned, organizers imagined somewhat of a traditional acquisition model in which the Rwandan partner would send their materials to UT Austin for digitization. UT would retain digital copies, and then the originals would be returned. As you can imagine, in practice, that never worked. Records creators, our partner organizations, were reluctant to relinquish custody of their materials, even temporarily. For one, they needed them to perform their daily work. These are living documents that are used in programming, advocacy, education, etc. And from a preservation standpoint, shipping the materials back and forth from Rwanda to Austin, and then with our other partners throughout Latin America and the rest of the world, it was risky, to say the least. So we needed to find another way, and we did. It was a post-custodial model that would address both custody and preservation concerns. So at LLILAS Benson, let's see, the model has 5 major components. First, that the archives remain locally accessible. This is something that you heard Ginny talk about as well. Second, we emphasize archival and digital capacity building on the ground by acting as on-site consultants on digitization, archival best practices, and even supplying necessary equipment that we transfer permanently to our partners. And we too have had the challenges of dealing with getting equipment to remote sites that Ginny described, including the inability to use state funds to do so. So here's another example where external funding is absolutely critical. And sometimes the challenge is just actually getting such equipment through customs in various countries. That's not, you can imagine that there are difficulties with that. And sometimes, you know, we have a plan in place or we rely on someone we know, and then sometimes we just go for it and sort of cross our fingers and see what happens at customs. But we've lost more than one piece of equipment just in that process. I mean, we're still functioning, but it just presents an interesting challenge. We create relationships with partners that are collaborative and horizontal, especially with regard to knowledge flow related to metadata and the materials that are described. We focus on digital technologies for preservation and access, and this is where acquisitions actually come in. So we call this a post-custodial archival model, but at Texas it's also referred to as post-custodial acquisitions. So there is an acquisitions piece of what we're doing. We're using our acquisitions, our collections funds, to essentially buy the resulting digital files. And that's how we're using our monies to inject funds into these projects and store. So what we get for our money are the digital files that we store on servers at Texas, and then our partners can use those funds to support the archive, typically by compensating its digitization staff. And this gets at questions raised yesterday about digitization and local control and questions of long-term preservation. So one way we're trying to deal with that is to make sure that the records end up on our own servers. And notice I didn't say necessarily open access. That's a topic I'll address a little bit later. There are reasons why that's appropriate in some cases and not in others. And I guess this will point to it as well. And finally, at Texas, our efforts have focused on human rights documentation, a particular class of archival material that is important in its local context and is often at risk for political reasons, as you can imagine, which is why the HRDI project that I mentioned has that web archiving component that Jeff talked about and that you can read more about when his final report comes out. But it's precisely because we focused on human rights documentation that the issue of preservation sometimes trumps open access. So perhaps our most high-profile example of post-custodial work at Texas thus far has been in Guatemala. As part of the aforementioned Human Rights Documentation Initiative in 2010, LLILAS Benson entered into a partnership with the Historical Archive of the Guatemalan National Police, known by its acronym of AHPN, to create an online digital repository for their collection. This archive, long denied by the Guatemalan government, was uncovered in 2005. Almost by accident. I can't remember if it was they were going to demolish a building or there was some work going on in a building, and it happened to appear. It contains nearly 80 million pages of archival material relating to the National Police, including documentation of their activities during Guatemala's brutal civil war. So you can imagine that it was never an option to remove these records from Guatemala. They are critical to ongoing transitional justice and reconciliation efforts, as well as serving the needs of families of the disappeared to discover what happened to their loved ones. In fact, records from the collection have provided crucial evidence in the prosecution of human rights abuses, such as forced disappearances and extrajudicial executions carried out by the Guatemalan National Police during that period. Even as all parties recognized that the archive couldn't be moved, at the time we entered into the agreement with the HPN, there was a real risk that the archive could be shut down and the collection destroyed. You can imagine, given its contents, why some powerful folks would want it to go away. So a post-custodial approach turned out to be the best way to protect the materials, and the resulting online repository provides a dissuasive counterbalance that helps safeguard the original materials while making them more discoverable to a global audience. And I should point out that work at the HPN is ongoing. There's actually has a long way to go. I mentioned that there are 80 million pages. I think what we've received, and it changes regularly, so I'm probably off on this, but we've received at Texas about 20 million. So there's a long way to go. Politically, it's at risk. It's it's losing staff. Given the current political climate and the current government in Guatemala right now, we are paying close attention to what is happening there, and we've been asked by the archive itself to advocate on its behalf, and we will do so in appropriate moments. But stay tuned. And if you're interested in learning more about the particular archive, not necessarily the post-custodial project, a historian at Harvard, Kirsten Weld, published a book on it called Paper Cadavers, The Archives of Dictatorship in Guatemala. So you probably have the book in your collection, and I would recommend checking it out. In 2014, after the HPN was launched, so to speak, LLILAS Benson received a planning grant from the Mellon Foundation, allowing us to take lessons learned from the HPN and early projects and to systematize them into a post-custodial methodology. Working with 3 partners in the region, which are listed here in Nicaragua, Guatemala, and El Salvador, our focus continued to be on the preservation of and access to vulnerable human rights documentation. So once again, instead of taking physical custody of these collections and bringing them to Texas, we focused on building local archival digital capacity in the region, providing training and equipment necessary to adequately preserve, describe, and digitize collections on site. Our partner institutions conducted the digitization work and created the descriptions that captured their unique insights into the collections. And we, again, are providing long-term preservation for the resulting digital files and online access to the collections through the Latin American Digital Initiatives Repository, or LADI, which was launched in November 2015. So to give you some specific examples of the kinds of materials we focus on for LADI, Sitka, our partner in Nicaragua, digitized a historical newspaper from the Atlantic Coast region that is one of very few archival sources documenting Nicaragua's Afro-descendant and indigenous communities. Our Salvadoran partner digitized a collection of posters, pamphlets, and clandestine publications from the Salvadoran conflict, offering unique perspectives on how the Civil War was lived and experienced on the ground. And finally, our Guatemala partner, CIRMA, digitized a collection of news clippings documenting how Guatemala's internal conflict developed and intensified. And in fact, this particular archive was a primary source for the team that drafted the UN Truth Commission report after the signing of Guatemala's peace accords. And while our team was on site in 2015 to set up the digitization workflow for the Mellon Planning Grant, the Guatemala Attorney General's office contacted them for access to the very records we were digitizing in preparation for an upcoming case that would seek to hold members of the military accountable for human rights violations during the conflict. So here's a quick screenshot. Doesn't look that impressive on that screen for the LADI repository that holds the digital files from this planning grant, provides access to them. HPN actually has its own database for various reasons, including the size of the project and the kinds of materials that are there and the unique human rights privacy concerns for that. The intention is for LADI to expand and be the home for all of our post-custodial collections that can indeed be open access. Last summer, LLILAS Benson received a new grant from Mellon, so you can see that the Mellon Foundation is very involved in this work to expand our post-custodial efforts in Latin America and to consolidate our local infrastructure in support of this work. So we are now doing what we call institutionalizing post-custodial praxis. That's a fancy term that encompasses post-custodial practice and theory, and we are launching 3 new projects. The first is a partnership with the Instituto Socioambiental, or ISA in Brazil, which is a nonprofit civil society organization founded in 1994 and focused on the defense of social and environmental rights. The project with ISA will preserve documentation of quilombos, or Afro-Brazilian settlements originally founded by escaped slaves. And these records are particularly at risk because they facilitate claims to land rights by the quilombos. The second partnership for the Mellon Grant is with the Proceso de Comunidades Negras, or the PCN in Colombia, which is a network of Black community organizations in Colombia and one of the principal actors advocating for Afro-Colombian rights and culture at the national level. Our third and final partner is the Parish Archive of San Andres in Cholula, Mexico, which consists of 64 boxes of ledgers dating from 1636 to 1926. So it's containing nearly 300 years of material. They're mostly ecclesiastical records that chronicle sacramental milestones in the lives of indigenous parishioners, but they also document the social functions, government, and economy of this community. And the archive as a whole has enormous research potential for indigenous political, social, and economic history, and the prevalence of Nahuatl documents makes it a valuable archive for linguists in particular. So you might wonder, how did you choose these particular projects? Because that's actually one of the biggest challenges. You can imagine once you set your sights on a particular model, okay, this post-custodial model, we've had some practice with it, it's working well. You can imagine the infinite number of partners that you could connect with throughout just Latin America itself. And you heard Ginny talk about partners throughout the world that they're working with for their ephemeral project. And it just boils down to, at this point, relationships, of course. because that's at the key of so much of what we do. So each of these projects has been developed in collaboration with a scholar stakeholder at UT Austin, one of them by a faculty member and then 2 by PhD students who will guide design and implementation of the projects. So these projects are actually tied to their research, resulting in more nuanced collection development and meaningful scholarly output. This also means, because you start with these relationships, that the idea is that once the initial projects are done, that you maintain contact with these organizations, and if you have those relationships in place, the likelihood of being able to do that is increased, and we find that to be very important. We are focused on ensuring ethical descriptions of sensitive cultural materials. So essentially this means that local communities take the lead on describing the materials. And the importance of that, I don't think, can be overstated. They take the lead on creating the metadata, since they know the collections best. And so this means they're retaining not only physical control of their collection, but intellectual control as well. This won't surprise anybody in this room, but it's also a reality that many of the common vocabularies for subject terms and standard metadata schemas don't include information relevant to the communities that we document, or the terms used are outdated and offensive. And so there's a lot of work that needs to be done on that part for the descriptions of them to adequately reflect their meaning to the local communities. And that in and of itself, the issue of description and representation could be an all-day conference. We internally are building our existing digital infrastructure to expand multilingual functionality, improve user experience, and develop best practice guidelines for providing access to culturally and politically sensitive materials, while also creating a blueprint for sustainable staffing and resource allocations. And so in this process, through the Mellon grant, we've been able to hire a specific metadata specialist as well as a digital processing archivist, and the intention is that UT Austin will keep those going once the Mellon money has run out. Fingers crossed. Taken together, we believe that this approach will provide new avenues for archivists, activists, scholars, and technical staff and community partners to engage with each other and produce innovative scholarship while placing UT Austin at the forefront of post-custodial practice. And as I wrap up, I wanted to just make sure I give credit where it's due, because I have the privilege of being the director of a library with an amazing team, and as I stand here talking to all of you, these folks are actually doing the work. Teresa Polk, our head of digital initiatives, David Bliss, our digital processing archivist, who's actually working closely with Jeff to get him information he needs on our web archiving aspects of our HRDI program, and then the Mellon-funded metadata librarian, and then also you can see that CLEAR is involved in this work somewhat as well. We have a CLEAR postdoctoral fellow for data curation, Hannah Albert Abrams, who's working specifically on our continued work with the AHPN archive in Guatemala. So in conclusion, I've given you an overview in very broad strokes, so I'm eager to engage in a conversation with you or answer any questions you have, but I wanted to mention 3 things. We're definitely shifting our focus at the Benson and at Texas toward post-custodial collections. We're not just moving toward, we are there, but we're not going to stop collecting in that traditional fashion either. We will do it differently, and it will change the questions we ask and the ways we do it, but we envision those models existing side by side for quite a long time. And sometimes we work in a hybrid fashion where a particular collection will come to Austin, but there are components that are better served by the post-custodial model, so we leave them on site. The most recent example was the acquisition of the papers of Father Ernesto Cardenal of Nicaragua, who was the Minister of Culture during the first Sandinista government. He was also a poet. He's still with us, a poet and a priest. When we looked at, he himself approached us about his collection. Given the current climate in Nicaragua and his current relationship with the government there, he thought it would be protected at the Benson. But when we reviewed the collection, we saw that there were also materials coming from the Ministry of Culture, and we immediately said, nope, we're not removing these. We can take your personal papers, but we will not remove the Ministry of Culture records. And so we were able to use a post-custodial model to digitize them safeguard, preserve the digital files, and then we have a relationship with Inca, a major archive and library in Managua, and we arranged to deposit those records there. So that's an example of one that we did in a hybrid fashion. And yesterday we talked quite a bit about the tension between privacy and access, and we're right at the heart of that. It's super relevant here. I have continually noted that we store digital files for preservation at Texas. Whether or not we make certain ones available depends on the kinds of materials they are, and because we tend to focus on human rights materials, we have to be very careful with that so that we're not putting folks at risk. That means sometimes we provide open access and sometimes we don't, and there are no simple formulas for figuring that out. And this is relevant because of what you've heard about many of the major funders who want to put money behind this work. Rightly so, they focus on open access, and UT Austin is very committed to open access. But Mellon, our partner in this major initiative, requires open access, so we had to choose partners and records that would fit that model. Clearly, Arcadia, that's working with EDEP at UCLA, also has that model, which is very good. But we need to acknowledge that there are some records that cannot follow that model. So the way we negotiate that with funders moving forward is going to be important. In fact, we have an archive waiting in Guatemala that cannot be made. We use a post-custodial model to preserve it, but it cannot be made accessible because it would put too many local people at risk. And so we are waiting until we can fund that internally because, where we look for external funds, we're not really eligible there. So that's just an issue that we're going to continue to have to grapple with. So we don't like things behind a paywall either, but some things shouldn't see the light of day if they can put folks at risk. And then finally, I want to acknowledge that whilst to a certain extent UT Austin has been at the forefront of institutionalizing this practice, we're certainly not the only ones thinking about it. You heard about UCLA, so I don't have to mention it. Haverford College has a project in Guatemala, and then there are other community archives that aren't necessarily tied to institutions that use a post-custodial approach, including the South Asian American Digital Archive that's based in Pennsylvania but has a University of Chicago connection. So it's happening outside of the university as well. And with that, I will stop and take your questions.
Thanks. That was a great presentation. Thanks. Exciting work you're doing. Bravo.
I'm not doing any of it. I'm standing up here talking to you guys.
You guys, you folks.
All right.
So your last point about why, obviously, for personal security reasons, not all content can be made open access, and finding the balance between, being pragmatic with funders versus, the requirements that they have. Are funders open to a kind of hybrid model where you open up for open access portions of an archive and have other parts of it, embargoed for a certain period of time or something like that?
That may be the case with some, and I don't want to speak for Mellon, but because Mellon is behind so much of our current initiative, it was pretty straightforward at the outset that we needed to pick projects that were open access. I wasn't part of the early conversations with them, so the extent to which we could negotiate that, I'm not sure, but it's definitely something to consider moving forward. But it also is a learning experience for human rights organizations too, who know, who over time may be able to anticipate participating in some of these projects in the way that they organize their files, the way they get permissions, et cetera. Not that everything can be made open, but it does also change the way we think about how we create the records in the first place.
First, a question of clarification,
Sure.
but then a suggestion.
Sure.
The post in post-custodial, I understand you to be referring to physical objects.
Right.
On the other hand, from your description of the project, it sounds as though you're still ingesting large quantities of digital objects. It makes me wonder if flying under a different banner, let's say something like neo-custodial, wouldn't be liberating and allow for connection in ways that were brought up yesterday in Derek Peterson's presentation and several other things we heard from Clifford earlier today.
Yeah.
I think it's a little bit disingenuous, if I could be blunt about it, to still call this post-custodial when you still are holding custodial responsibility.
Sure, and that's an excellent point. And I think, you know, I think the short answer is that the term was attractive because it was recognized in the archival community initially. So point well taken that it's something that could be reworked moving forward. And certainly there are professional archivists who are having these conversations all the time, and the extent to which Texas can be part of that, we should be. We have on site, we have an archival theory reading group, and I don't get to attend as much as I'd like, but I'm guessing that they're having these very conversations within that group, so I will definitely take that suggestion back. Absolutely.
So just further to Jim Nye's just last point,
Yeah.
maybe what you want is post-plunder model.
Yeah.
So you
yeah.
you can be custodial without being plundering.
Yes, that is true. That's true. Absolutely.